The Nausicaan captain's blood ran cold as the human warship emerged from warp, its sleek predatory hull overflowing with gun turrets and missile tubes. This was no mere patrol frigate. It was a Yorktown-class heavy cruiser, built for the express purpose of crushing the Nausicaan raiders who had been terrorizing human colonies. Aboard the UES Dauntless, Lieutenant Keith Campbell jolted awake as alarms blared and red emergency lights strobed through the crew quarters. He leapt from his bunk, threw on his uniform, and sprinted to the CIC. Captain Briggs stood grimly at the holotable, teeth clenched as she addressed her officers. "Listen up, people. A Nausicaan raiding party hit the colony on Epsilon Ceti III. They've taken hostages and fortified their position. We're the closest ship, so Starfleet Command has tasked us with responding at maximum warp to secure the colonists' release or evacuation. I don't need to tell you what's at stake here. Those colonists are counting on us." Keith swallowed hard, a mix of anticipation and anxiety churning in his gut. The Nausicaans were a brutal reptilian species, raiders who struck hard and fast before vanishing back into the void. Starfleet had been unable to pin them down long enough to deliver any payback. Until now. As the crew rushed to battle stations, Keith's friend Mike elbowed him in the ribs. "Guess the brass wants to see what these new Yorktown-class ships can really do, huh? Time to show those Nausicaan bastards what happens when you mess with humanity." Keith nodded as he slid into his station and began running diagnostics on the cruiser's fearsome array of particle beam cannons and aerospace strike craft wings. The Dauntless had been built for this, to be the sharp end of the spear, humanity's iron fist against the hostile races who sought to prey on them. He pictured the colonists huddled in terror, praying for rescue before the Nausicaans dragged them back to a fate worse than death in the raiders' filthy slaveholds. Keith's expression resolute with drive. That wasn't going to happen, not on his watch. Not while humanity still had teeth. It was time to show the galaxy what human warships could do. Keith and Mike rushed to the armory, the ship-wide battle alert blaring in their ears. They quickly stripped out of their uniforms and began donning their Wolverine heavy power armor, the heavy plates clicking into place over their muscular frames. Keith grabbed his T-90 plasma rifle and slung it over his shoulder, while Mike hefted a MK6 auto shotgun loaded with depleted uranium slugs. "Hostage situation, huh?" Mike said as he racked the slide on his shotgun. "Figures those Nausicaan bastards would stoop that low. Bet they'll be shitting themselves when they see us coming in these bad boys, though." Keith just nodded, his mind already racing through potential breach and clear tactics. In the CIC, Captain Briggs leaned over the holotable, studying the tactical display of the colony and the Nausicaan ships in orbit. Suddenly, the screen flickered, and the sneering face of Commodore Janus appeared. His sharp teeth bared in a vicious grin. "Captain Briggs," Janus hissed, "I see your little warship is on its way to try and play hero. Unfortunately for you, I've taken certain precautions. My warriors have placed plasma bombs among the hostages. If you or any of your ships come within 1 light minute of the colony, I will detonate them. Hundreds will die most painfully." Briggs's eyes narrowed, but she kept her voice level. "What do you want, Janus?" The Nausicaan Commodore's grin widened. "Surrender, Captain. Give me your ship and its precious advanced weapons. Do this, and I will consider sparing the colonists' lives. You have 1 hour to comply." Briggs slammed a fist on the holotable. "Starfleet does not negotiate with terrorists and butchers, Commodore. If you harm those hostages, there will be nowhere in this galaxy you can hide from us." Janus snarled, his face contorting with rage. "It is you who should hide, human. I will splatter your precious colonists' blood across the stars, and that of your crew next." The transmission abruptly cut out. Briggs took a deep breath and turned to her officers. "Battle stations, people, and get me a line to Lieutenant Campbell. I have a feeling we're going to need his Marines for this one." As Keith and Mike finished suiting up, the tactical net in their HUDs suddenly flashed an urgent message from the captain. It was terse and to the point. Hostages in danger, plasma bombs in play, covert extraction needed. Keith frowned as he processed the information, but he knew what had to be done. "Change of plans, buddy," he said to Mike. Looks like we're going to have to do this quiet and careful like. Let's get the rest of the strike team and come up with an insertion plan. As the Dauntless dropped out of warp on the outskirts of the Epsilon Ceti system, the long-range sensors screamed a warning. 8 Nausicaan knife fighters were already in orbit around the colony, and the sensors had picked up a fresh warp rift forming in the outer system. More hostiles pouring out to reinforce their brethren. "Aerospace wings, you are cleared to launch," Briggs barked into the ship-wide comms. "Neutralize those new arrivals before they can link up with the ones at the colony. Buy our strike team time to get those colonists out of there." Keith watched on the monitors as the Dauntless's fighter wings streaked out of the hangar bays. The wedge-shaped scimitar aerospace superiority craft looking like birds of prey as they clawed for altitude. They'd get the job done, he was sure of it. Now, he just had to do the same. Keith's strike team silently boarded the matte black assault shuttle, the small craft's cloaking field shimmering to life as it slipped out of the dauntless hangar bay. In the cockpit, Corporal Jenna Hartley deftly guided the shuttle through the chaos of the orbital battle, raging around the colony, the nimble ship ducking and weaving to avoid stray plasma blasts and debris. "Sensors are picking up the hostages, LT," Jenna reported, her voice calm and professional despite the dire situation. "Looks like the Nausicans have them corralled in the central plaza. I count a dozen tangos on guard duty." Keith nodded, studying the tactical feed on his HUD. "Roger that, take us in quiet and drop us on the rooftop overlooking the plaza. We'll cloak up and move in for the extraction." The shuttle ghosted over the colony's buildings, its muffled engines barely a whisper. It flared its landing thrusters at the last moment, touching down on a rooftop with cat-like grace. Keith and his Marines quickly disembarked, their armor's active camouflage engaging as they crept to the edge of the roof. Below them, the hostages huddled in terror as the Nausicaan guards paced back and forth, their reptilian eyes scanning for any sign of trouble. Keith signaled his team to spread out and take up positions to cover the plaza from all angles. Suddenly one of the Nausicaan sentries whirled around, his plasma rifle coming up to aim directly at Private Mike Sorensen's position. The alien unleashed a searing blue bolt of energy that slammed into Mike's armor, the advanced composite plating absorbing the worst of the blast. But the damage was done. Their cover was blown. "Contact! Open fire!" Keith barked into the comms, his own rifle snapping up to draw a bead on the nearest Nausicaan. The plaza erupted into a maelstrom of Gauss rounds and plasma fire as the two sides engaged in a vicious, close-quarters battle. The Marines' superior weaponry and armor gave them a decisive edge, and one by one the Nausicaan guards fell under the withering hail of fire, but not before they managed to gun down several of the helpless hostages in a final act of spiteful cruelty. As the last shots died away, Keith and his team rushed to secure the remaining colonists, checking them for injuries and radioing for immediate medevac. Suddenly, a massive explosion ripped through a nearby building, the shockwave knocking several Marines off their feet. The Nausicans had detonated one of their plasma bombs as a final fuck you to their human adversaries. Keith keyed his comms, his voice grim. "Captain Briggs, this is Lieutenant Campbell. We've secured the hostages, but the Nausicans set off one of their bombs. We've got multiple casualties and need immediate extraction." Briggs' voice crackled over the net, tinged with static from the ongoing space battle. "Acknowledged, Lieutenant. Our fighters have neutralized the enemy ships that came through the warp rift, but we're still heavily engaged with the ones in orbit. I'm bringing the Dauntless in to assist, but you should expect heavy enemy reinforcements to hit the colony soon. Dig in and hold the line until we can get you out of there." Briggs out. Keith turned to his strike team, his expression hardening behind his visor. They all knew what those incoming Nausicaan reinforcements meant, a bloody, desperate battle to keep the remaining colonists alive long enough for extraction. But they were Marines. This is what they trained for. "You heard the captain. Let's get these civvies to a defensible position and prepare for the shitstorm that's about to hit us. Ura?" "Hurrah!" his Marines chorused back, their voices filled with grim dedication. They knew many of them likely wouldn't be leaving this colony alive, but they would make damn sure the Nausicans paid a heavy price for every inch of ground and every human life. As the team moved out, herding the shell-shocked colonists to a nearby bunker complex, the first Nausicaan drop pods began slamming into the colony's outskirts. Keith watched them fall, his grip tightening on his rifle. The real battle was about to begin. Keith's boots pounded on the permacrete as he and his Marines hustled the remaining colonists towards the waiting assault shuttle. Plasma bolts sizzled through the air as a fresh wave of Nausicaan soldiers stormed into the colony, having just beamed down from their ships in orbit. The aliens let out guttural war cries, their razor-sharp teeth bared as they charged towards the humans. "Covering fire!" Keith barked, dropping to one knee and sighting down his rifle. The weapon kicked against his shoulder as he sent a burst of hypersonic slugs screaming towards the advancing Nausicans. Beside him, Mike and the other Marines opened up as well, their weapons stitching deadly patterns across the enemy's ranks. Several Nausicans dropped, their armor perforated by the Marines' relentless fire. But more kept coming, hurdling the bodies of their fallen comrades. Keith cursed under his breath, ejecting a spent magazine and slamming a fresh one home. They just needed to buy a little more time. In the skies above, the Dauntless shuddered as a plasma torpedo slammed into its forward shields. On the bridge, Captain Briggs gripped the arms of her command chair as the deck pitched beneath her feet. "Shields at 30%, the tactical officer shouted over the din of battle. "We can't take much more of this." Briggs gritted her teeth as she watched the Nausicaan knife fighters swarming around her beleaguered ship like a pack of hyenas. The Dauntless's particle beam cannons lashed out again and again, spearing the enemy ships with lances of brilliant energy. But for every knife fighter they destroyed, 2 more seemed to take its place. "Concentrate fire on their lead ships," Briggs ordered, "and get our fighter wings back here to cover us." On the planet below, Keith watched with a surge of relief as the last of the colonists clambered aboard the assault shuttle. The ship's engines flared to life, kicking up a cloud of dust and debris as it lifted off from the plaza. But just as the shuttle clawed for altitude, a plasma grenade arced through the air and detonated against its rear quarter. The ship lurched drunkenly, smoke pouring from its damaged engine. "Get those civilians out of here," Keith shouted over the comms. "We'll cover you." As the wounded shuttle limped away, Keith and his Marines hunkered down behind the shattered remnants of a stone fountain. Nausicaan soldiers poured into the plaza, plasma rifles blazing. Keith popped up from cover, his rifle bucking in his hands as he put a burst into a charging alien. The Nausicaa's head snapped back, ichor spraying from its shattered skull. "Frag out!" Mike yelled, lobbing a plasma grenade over the fountain. The explosive detonated in the midst of a group of Nausicaans, scattering their smoking bodies across the plaza. But more kept coming, an endless tide of snarling reptilian killers. Keith knew they were out of time. He keyed his comms, his voice ragged with exhaustion and spent adrenaline. "All units, this is Lieutenant Campbell. Fall back to secondary defensive positions. We'll make our stand in the colony's central bunker complex." As the Marines began a fighting withdrawal, harried every step of the way by the relentless Nausicaans, the space battle took a desperate turn. A plasma torpedo punched through the Dauntless' weakened shields and slammed into its warp drive. The ship shuddered violently, consoles exploding in showers of sparks across the bridge. "Warp drive is offline," the helmsman reported, his voice edged with panic. "We're dead in the water." Briggs pounded a fist on her armrest, her face a mask of commitment. She knew this was it. The Nausicaans would tear her crippled ship apart, but she'd be damned if she'd let them have it easily. "All fighter wings, form up and cover us," she barked into the fleet comms. "Engineering, I need that warp drive back yesterday, and someone get me firing solutions on every Spirit's damn Nausicaan ship out there." As the crew scrambled to carry out her orders, and the Dauntless's guns hammered defiance at the encircling Nausicaans, Briggs found herself thinking of Keith and his Marines down on the planet. She knew they'd fight to the last, just like her crew. But against these odds, suddenly the sensor officer's console lit up like a Christmas tree. He blinked in disbelief, hardly daring to hope. "Captain, new contact bearing 227 Marco 81. It's a fleet of human ships. They're hailing us." Briggs whirled in her chair as the bridge viewscreen flickered to life. She found herself staring at the weathered, scarred visage of Admiral Tran, the legendary commander of the UES Invincible. "Heard you could use some help, Captain," Tran said, his voice a gravelly rumble. "Let's show these Nausicaan bastards what happens when you piss off the human race." As Tran's words sank in, Briggs saw the massive shapes of human battleships and cruisers pouring out of the warp rift, their guns already blazing as they tore into the Nausicaans' exposed flank. The enemy ships reeled under the sudden onslaught, their formation shattering as they scrambled to reorient to face this new threat. Briggs felt a fierce grin spread across her face. They had a fighting chance now. She leaned forward in her chair, her eyes hard. "All ships weapons free, let's finish this." Keith's eyes widened as the Nausicaan lunged at him, the alien's knife glinting in the harsh sunlight. He jerked to the side, the blade missing his throat by inches. The Nausicaan snarled, its reptilian eyes blazing with hatred as it slashed again. Keith parried the blow with his armored forearm, the knife's edge skittering across the cracked composite plating. He drove his other fist into the Nausicaan's gut, feeling the alien's scales crack under the force of the blow. The Nausicaan grunted but didn't go down, instead headbutting Keith with brutal force. Stars exploded across Keith's vision as he staggered back, his helmet's visor spiderwebbing from the impact. The Nausicaan pressed its advantage, its knife darting in again and again, seeking the weak points in Keith's armor. Keith backpedaled, his boots scrambling for purchase on the loose gravel. He could feel blood trickling down his face from a cut above his eye, the coppery taste filling his mouth. His armor's systems screamed warning after warning at him. Power levels critical, structural integrity compromised, life support failing. In the skies above, the tide of battle had turned with the arrival of the Invincible and its fleet. The Nausicaan ships, suddenly faced with a wall of human guns, broke and ran, their hulls pocked with glowing craters from the dauntless, vengeful fire. But even as they fled, the aliens spat one last barrage of plasma torpedoes at the Dauntless. The ship's point defense grid lit up, bright lances of energy impaling the incoming warheads. Explosions blossomed in the void, the Dauntless armor shrugging off the plasma blasts. All but one. A single torpedo, its guidance system shattered by a near miss, corkscrewed drunkenly through the defensive fire and slammed into the Dauntless's port side like the fist of an angry god. Armor plating shattered, atmosphere venting in a crystalline spray as the ship lurched under the impact. On the bridge, Captain Briggs clung to her command chair as the deck heaved beneath her feet. Damage alarms howled, the cries of the wounded filling the smoke-choked air. "Damage report!" Briggs barked, her eyes fierce. "Hull breach on decks 7 through 12, the damage control officer shouted back, his face pale. "Emergency bulkheads are in place, but we've got crew trapped behind them." Briggs's heart made. She knew what those bulkheads meant, an impenetrable barrier between the crew and safety, a cold equation that sacrificed the few to save the many. Every captain's nightmare. On the planet, Keith barely heard the chatter over the comms. His world narrowed down to the snarling Nausicaan before him. The alien was weakening, green blood oozing from a dozen wounds, but it refused to fall. It came at him again, its knife seeking his throat. Keith caught the Nausicaan's wrist, the two of them grappling for control of the blade. The alien was strong, its muscles like steel cables beneath its scales. Keith's armor groaned, servos whining as he pitted his enhanced strength against the Nausicaan's raw fury. Suddenly the ground beside them erupted in a geyser of dirt and flame. Keith's head snapped up, his eyes widening as he saw a flight of Raptor attack helicopters screaming over the battlefield, their rocket pods and Gauss cannons hammering the Nausicaan positions. The aliens scattered, their formation disintegrating under the onslaught. Keith seized his chance, keying his comms with a shout. "This is Lieutenant Campbell. I need an emergency beam out now." But even as he spoke, his eyes caught a flicker of movement. A wounded Nausicaan, its armor smoking and shattered, rose from the rubble, a plasma launcher cradled in its arms. It aimed at the hovering Raptors, its finger tightening on the trigger. Keith moved without thinking, releasing the Nausicaan he was grappling with and launching himself at the other alien. He slammed into it just as it fired, the plasma grenade arcing harmlessly into the air to detonate in a blinding flash. The explosion threw Keith and the Nausicaan back, sending them tumbling over the cliff's edge. They fell, the alien's claws scrabbling at Keith's armor as they plummeted towards the jagged rocks below. Keith felt the bone-jarring impact as they hit the ground, his armor cracking like an eggshell. Pain lanced through him, hot and sharp. Through bleary eyes he saw the Nausicaan soldier struggling to rise, a wicked-looking knife clutched in its fist. It lunged at him, its eyes burning with primal hate, the blade flashing down. Keith gritted his teeth as he caught the Nausicaan's knife hand in his armored grip, servos whining with the strain. Pain lanced up his injured arm at the jarring impact, nearly making him lose his hold. The Nausicaan hissed, its fetid breath washing over Keith's visor as it lunged forward, trying to bear him down with its sheer mass. They rolled across the rocky ground, a tangle of straining limbs and scraping armor plates. Keith's HUD flickered, damage alerts flashing red in his peripheral vision. He could feel the Nausicaan's claws scrabbling at his chest plate, seeking purchase, seeking to rip and tear. With a roar of effort, Keith heaved himself upward, forcing the Nausicaan back. He pinned its knife hand to the ground, his other gauntlet closing around its throat. The alien thrashed beneath him, its eyes bulging with rage and hate. "Yield," Keith snarled through clenched teeth. "It's over." The Nausicaan spat, a glob of viscous saliva splattering across Keith's visor. "Never," it rasped, its voice thick with loathing. "I will not submit to a human. I would rather die." For a moment, Keith tightened his grip, the servos in his gauntlet whirring with deadly potential. It would be so easy to crush, to end this here and now. But as he stared down at the Nausicaan, its scales torn and leaking ichor, its hate-filled eyes still defiant, he couldn't do it. With a grunt, he raised his fist and brought it down on the alien's jaw with calculated force. The Nausicaan went limp, its head lolling back. Panting, Keith slumped back, his hand fumbling for the emergency beacon on his belt. He thumbed it on, a green light winking in the gloom. Extraction imminent. Now he just had to stay alive long enough for it to matter. High above, the void of space lit with the fires of dying ships. The Invincible and its mighty battle group tore into the Nausicaan fleet, Gauss cannons and particle lances ripping through knife-fighter hulls like they were made of paper. The aliens reeled under the onslaught, their formation shattering like glass. On the bridge of his crippled flagship, Commodore Janus slammed a fist on his command throne, a snarl twisting his lips. Alarms blared, consoles sparking and flickering around him. He could see the human ships closing in on the console, their hulls filled with weapons eager to finish the kill. "This is not over," he hissed, his eyes burning with fanatic light. "We will have our revenge. The humans will pay for this insult in blood." His claw stabbed down on a pulsing red button set into his armrest. A klaxon began to blare, a voice booming in guttural Nausicaan. "Self-destruct sequence initiated. All personnel to escape pods." Janus remained where he was as his bridge crew fled, a cruel smile playing across his lips. The humans thought they had won. They were wrong. This was only the beginning. He watched the human ships grow larger on the screen, blazing with the reflected light of his dying fleet. Just a little closer. With a roar that seemed to shake the very fabric of space, Janus's flagship exploded, a miniature sun blooming in the void. The blast wave caught the closest human ships, sending them tumbling away, hulls scorched and shields flickering. On the Dauntless's bridge, Captain Briggs flinched as the light of the explosion washed over the viewports. Damage reports flooded in, the ship's computer cool and calm as it rattled off a litany of woe. "Hull breaches on decks 9 through 13. Fires reported in engineering. Medbay is overloaded with casualties. Warp drive remains offline." Briggs focused his mind, his gaze locked on the fading fury of Janus's funeral pyre. The Nausicaan was dead, but at what cost? How many more had he taken with him in his final spite? The comm crackled, a voice tight with pain and exhaustion breaking through the static. "Captain Briggs, this is Lieutenant Campbell. I've been recovered by a SAR team, en route to the Dauntless now." Briggs let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Keith was alive. Battered, no doubt, but alive. It was more than many could say. "Understood, Lieutenant," he replied, his voice rough. "Report to Medbay immediately upon arrival. And Keith, good work down there." There was a pause, a hitch of breath that might have been a laugh or a groan. "Thank you, sir. Campbell out." Briggs slumped back in his chair, his eyes closing for a brief moment. They had won. The colony was safe, the civilians evacuated. The Nausicaan threat, at least for now, had been broken. But the cost... He shook himself, straightening his shoulders. There would be time for grief later, time to count the dead and mourn the lost. But now, there was still work to be done. "Helm, set a course for the nearest starbase," he ordered, his voice steady. "Best possible speed and get me a line to the Invincible. I need to speak with Admiral Tran." He had a feeling that this was nowhere near the end. The Nausicans had been beaten back but not broken. They would regroup, rebuild, and return, and humanity had to be ready. But for now, for this moment, they could breathe. They could heal. They could look to the stars and know that once again they had held the line. Once again they had proven that when the galaxy pushed, humanity pushed back. And heaven help anything that stood in their way. Keith lay on the medical bed, the soft beeping of the monitors filling the room. The nanomachines coursed through his bloodstream, knitting bones and mending torn flesh. He stared at the ceiling, replaying the battle in his mind. The screams of the colonists, the sizzle of plasma bolts, the crunch of Nausicaan bones under his armored fists. The knock at the door jolted him from his thoughts. "Come in," he rasped, his throat still raw from shouting orders over the din of combat. Captain Briggs stepped into the room, his face lined with exhaustion. "Lieutenant Campbell, it's good to see you awake." Keith struggled to sit up, wincing as his battered body protested. "Thank you, sir. The colonists. Did they all make it?" Briggs nodded. "Thanks to you and your team. You did a hell of a job down there, Keith. I've put you in for a commendation." Keith shook his head. "I was just doing my duty, sir. We all were." Briggs pulled up a chair and sat down heavily. "I just came from a briefing with Starfleet Intelligence. They've been interrogating the Nausicaan prisoner you captured." Keith's eyes narrowed. "What did he say?" "That the attack on the colony was a test. The Nausicans wanted to see how our New Yorktown-class ships would perform in a real fight. They deliberately targeted the colony to lure us in." Keith's fists clenched, his palms squeezing firmly. "They used those civilians as bait, sacrificed their own soldiers just to bloody our noses." Briggs sighed. "It gets worse. The prisoner claims this was just the beginning, that the Nausicaan High Command is planning more attacks like this. They want to bleed us dry, force us to overextend ourselves defending every frontier outpost and colony." Keith felt a cold knot form in his gut. So Epsilon Ceti, all those lives lost, it was for nothing? "No," Briggs said firmly. "We showed the Nausicans that we won't be pushed around, that we'll fight tooth and nail to protect our own. Janus and his fleet paid the price for their arrogance." Keith looked down at his hands, remembering the feel of the Nausicaan scales under his gauntlets, the hot spray of alien blood on his visor. How many more, though? How many more colonies will suffer before this is over? Briggs stood, placing a hand on Keith's shoulder. "I don't know. But I do know that as long as we have soldiers like you, the Nausicans will never prevail. Get some rest, Lieutenant. The fight's not over yet." As Briggs left the room, Keith slumped back onto the bed, his mind racing. The Dauntless limped through space, the distant gleam of the starbase growing steadily larger in the viewports. Repair drones swarmed over the ship's hull, sparks flying as they labored to mend the battle scars. The starbase hung in the void like a glittering jewel, its spinning habitation ring glinting in the light of the system's star. Shuttles flitted to and fro, offloading wounded and taking on supplies. As the Dauntless slid into its berth, a cheer went up from the station's crew. echoed by the rescued colonists waiting in the docking bay. Keith, limping slightly and supported by Mike, made his way down the boarding ramp to a hero's welcome. People surged forward to shake his hand, to clap him on the back, their faces alight with gratitude and admiration. But even as he basked in the warmth of their praise, Keith couldn't shake the chill that had settled in his bones. The Norsicans were still out there, plotting their next move. How long until another colony burned? How long until more innocents died? His dark musings were interrupted by a shout from the crowd. "The Invincible, she's breaking orbit!" Keith turned to see the mighty battleship pulling away from the station, her engines flaring blue. A murmur ran through the assembled throng, confusion and fear mingling in their voices. "What's happening?" Mike asked, his brow furrowed. Keith's mind focused as the realization hit him. They've found another target. The Norsicans have hit another colony. "God damn it," Mike swore softly. "It never ends, does it?" Keith could only watch helplessly as the Invincible vanished into the depths of space, speeding toward yet another battlefield. The Dauntless, her wounds still fresh, could do nothing but wait and heal. And in that moment, Keith felt a weariness that no amount of rest could cure, a bitter frustration at his own helplessness, at the seeming futility of it all. They had won the battle, but the war stretched on, an endless treadmill of violence and suffering. He looked down at his hands, remembering the weight of his weapon, the recoil that had shuddered up his arms as he cut down Norsican after Norsican. Was this his destiny? To fight and bleed and watch his comrades die, all for a peace that seemed forever out of reach? He had no answers, only the cold certainty that the fight would go on, that it must go on, for the sake of the colonists, for the sake of all humanity, no matter the cost, no matter the scars it left on his soul. He was a Marine, and he would do his duty, even if it killed him. The medbay doors hissed open, and Keith looked up from his bed to see a trio of Starfleet engineers striding towards him, their faces etched with a mix of excitement and concern. The lead engineer, a tall, wiry man with a shock of greying hair, extended his hand. "Lieutenant Campbell, I'm Dr. Sorensen, Chief of Weapons Research. We need to talk." Keith sat up straighter, ignoring the twinge in his mending ribs. "What's this about, Doc?" Sorensen glanced at his colleagues before speaking. "We've been analyzing the captured Norsican tech, specifically their plasma rifles, and we've found something disturbing." He tapped a command into his datapad, and a holographic schematic sprang to life above Keith's bed. It was a Norsican plasma rifle, but there was something different about it. The plasma coils were larger, more intricately wound. "This is a new type of weapon, Lieutenant. It fires a plasma bolt with an oscillating frequency that allows it to slip right through our armor's shielding, even the Wolverines." Keith felt a chill run down his spine as he remembered the searing pain of the plasma bolt that had breached his own armor. My God, if they had these on Epsilon Ceti. "Every Marine in that colony would be dead," Sorensen finished grimly. "We got lucky this time, but we might not be so lucky next time." Keith's fists clenched. "So what's the plan? How do we stop these things?" The engineer's face lit up with a fierce grin. "We're working on a countermeasure, a way to modulate our armor's shields to block that oscillating frequency. But we need your help." Keith swung his legs off the bed, standing to face Sorensen eye to eye. "What do you need me to do?" Over the next several weeks, Keith practically lived in the research labs, working hand in hand with Sorensen's team. They ran countless simulations, testing different shield modulations against the captured Norsican weapons. Keith's combat experience proved invaluable, helping the engineers understand how the weapons might be used in a real battle. It was grueling work, with long hours and countless setbacks, but Keith pushed himself harder than he ever had before. He knew what was at stake. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the faces of the colonists who had died on Epsilon Ceti. He heard the screams of his Marines as the plasma bolts tore through their armor like it was paper. Never again, he swore to himself, never again. While Keith and the engineers raced to perfect the countermeasure, the war raged on. Reports flooded in of Nausicaan attacks across the frontier, each one bolder and more vicious than the last. The Invincible and its fleet were running themselves ragged trying to respond to every distress call, every plea for help. But it was never enough. For every Nausicaan ship they destroyed, 2 more seemed to take its place, and now the aliens were targeting civilian vessels, cargo freighters and passenger liners. Thousands of innocents died in the cold of space, their ships shattered by plasma torpedoes and knife fighter guns. In the halls of Starfleet Command, grim-faced admirals pored over star charts and fleet dispositions. They all knew the truth. This was no longer a border conflict, a skirmish between patrol fleets. This was a war for survival, and the Nausicaans would not stop until humanity lay broken at their feet. The decision was made. The Nausicaans had to be stopped once and for all. And to do that, Starfleet would have to take the fight to the enemy's doorstep, to the Nausicaan homeworld itself. The orders came down and the fleet began to gather. The Dauntless, its scars repaired and its armor gleaming, took its place at the heart of the formation, and in its hangar bay, Keith stood before his Marines, a fierce light in his eyes. "This is it, Marines," he said, his voice ringing with barely contained fury. "This is what we've been fighting for. Out there is an enemy that wants nothing more than to see us all dead. They've hurt us, they've bled us. They think they can break us." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the assembled warriors. "But they're wrong, because they don't know what we're capable of. They don't know the lengths we'll go to protect our own, and they sure as hell don't know the fury they've unleashed." Keith's hand came to rest on the stock of his Gauss rifle, the weapon's barrel glinting in the hangar's lights. At his hip, a new addition, a plasma pistol, its emitter modulated with the countermeasure he'd helped create, a reminder of the price they'd paid and the debt they would collect. "We're the tip of the spear. We're the ones who will take the fight to the Nausicaans' own soil, and we will make them pay for every life they've taken, every drop of human blood they've spilled." A roar of approval swept through the ranks, armored fists pounding against chest plates in a thunderous cacophony. Keith nodded, his own heart pounding with the same righteous anger. "Gear up and get to your pods. We drop in 30. And Marines, give 'em hell." As the Marines dispersed to their assault craft, Keith took a moment to stare out the hangar bay's shimmering energy field at the stars beyond. Out there, the Nausicaan homeworld waited, its defenses filled with the weapons of war. It would be a fight like none he'd ever seen, a crucible that would test him and his Marines to their very limits. But they would not falter. They could not. Because this was more than just another battle. This was a reckoning, a chance to finally bring an end to the Nausicaans' reign of terror. And as Keith stepped into his own assault pod, he felt a grim sense of purpose settle over him like a shroud. Come what may, he would see this through. For the fallen, for the innocent, for the future of humanity itself. The pod door sealed with a hiss, and Keith felt the familiar kick of the launch thrusters. He closed his eyes, picturing the Nausicaan homeworld growing larger in his mind's eye. It was time to finish this. The warp tunnel collapsed into a dazzling starfield as the human fleet emerged in the Nausicaan home system, but there was no time to admire the view. Space lit up with the angry red flashes of plasma fire as a massive swarm of Nausicaan ships surged to meet them, a filled wall of knife-shaped hulls and spinal-mounted cannons. On the bridge of the Dauntless, Captain Briggs leaned forward in his chair, his eyes hard. "All ships, engage at will, concentrate fire on their heaviest ships, and watch out for those plasma lances." The human fleet, 100 strong with the Yorktown-class cruisers at its core, met the Nausicaan charge head-on. Particle beams and Gauss cannons flashed back and forth between the opposing lines, shields flaring and hulls buckling under the onslaught. In the Dauntless's drop bay, Keith felt the deck shudder beneath his armored boots as the ship took a glancing hit. Around him, his Marines checked their weapons one last time, faces grim behind their visors. 30 seconds, the drop bay controller announced. "Stand by to deploy." Keith chinned his comm. "Captain, we're ready to go. Wish us luck." "Give 'em hell, Lieutenant," Briggs replied, his voice tight. "We'll keep them off your back as long as we can." The drop bay doors yawned open, the blue curve of the Nausicaan homeworld filling the gap. Keith could see the flashes of orbital defense platforms and swarming fighter craft. This was going to be a hot landing. "Go, go, go!" Keith roared as the drop pods slammed down their launch rails, the brutal acceleration crushing him back into his crash couch. Plasma bolts streaked past the pod's tiny viewports as the Nausicaan point defenses bracketed them. The pod screamed down through the atmosphere, trailing tails of superheated plasma. Keith gritted his teeth as the G-forces mounted, threatening to crush him into unconsciousness. Just a little longer. With bone-jarring force, the pod slammed into the ground, kicking up geysers of dirt and pulverized rock. Keith was out of his harness and moving before the hatch had fully opened, his Gauss rifle already spitting death at the Nausicaan soldiers swarming to meet them. All around him, Marines poured out of their pods, forming up into fire teams and squads. Plasma bolts sizzled overhead as the Nausicaans opened up with crew-served weapons and fixed emplacements. "Move, move, get to cover!" Keith bellowed, sprinting for a low ridgeline. His Marines followed, leapfrogging each other with covering fire. They hit the ridge and hunkered down, returning fire at the advancing Nausicaans. The air crackled with the ozone tang of plasma and the electrical snap of Gauss rounds. "Sir!" Corporal Jenna Hartley called out, pointing to the sky. "Look!" Keith followed her gaze and felt his blood run cold. Descending from orbit was a massive construct of metal and composites, dripping with gun turrets. And mounted on its underbelly was the biggest plasma cannon Keith had ever seen, its barrel glowing an angry red as it slowly traversed to point at the battling fleets above. Keith keyed his long-range comm, fighting to keep his voice steady. "Captain Briggs, are you seeing this? The Nausicaans have some kind of superweapon in orbit." There was a burst of static. Then Briggs's voice filled Keith's helmet, strained and harried. "We see it, Lieutenant. That thing's tearing through our ships easily. Analysis says a direct hit could cripple even the Invincible. You've got to take it out." Keith swallowed hard, his mind racing. A frontal assault would be suicide, even with the new plasma countermeasures. They needed to get inside that station, take it apart from within. And for that, they needed a way in. His eyes fell on a damaged Nausicaan shuttle, smoke rising from rents in its hull as it wallowed toward a landing zone a click to the east. A desperate plan began to form in Keith's mind. "Captain, I have an idea, but I'm going to need a diversion. A big one." There was a moment of silence on the comm. Then Briggs spoke, his voice heavy with understanding. "You'll have it, Lieutenant. Just make it count. Briggs out." Keith turned to his squad leaders, the men and women he trusted above all others. "Hartley, Sorensen, Akari, you're with me. We're going to commandeer that shuttle and get aboard that station. The rest of you, dig in and give 'em hell. Buy us as much time as you can." There were no words of protest, no hesitation, just a chorus of "Aye, sir," and the click of weapons being made ready. Keith nodded, pride and fear warring in his chest. "Let's move out, Marines, and Godspeed to us all." Keith stood at the edge of the rubble-strewn plaza, his rifle held loosely at his side. Around him, his Marines were setting up a perimeter, securing key buildings and rounding up the last few Nausicaan soldiers who had yet to surrender. But even as they went about their duties with professional efficiency, Keith could sense the unease that hung over them like a pall. He turned to survey the ruins of the Nausicaan capital, his eyes tracing over the shattered remnants of once proud buildings and the blackened craters left by orbital bombardment. The streets were choked with debris and the twisted remains of vehicles, and the air was thick with the acrid tang of smoke and death. It was a scene that had become all too familiar to Keith over the long months of the war. But now, with the fighting finally over and the process of occupation beginning, he found himself confronted with the true cost of their victory. Everywhere he looked, he saw the signs of a people broken and beaten, Nausicaan civilians huddled in makeshift shelters, their eyes hollow and haunted. Children picked through the rubble, searching for scraps of food or anything of value, and everywhere the dead lay where they had fallen, their bodies left to rot in the sun. Keith felt a sudden surge of anger and frustration. What was the point of it all? What had they really achieved here beyond more death and destruction? He thought of the brave Marines who had fought and died under his command, and the countless Nausicaan soldiers and civilians who had perished in the relentless onslaught of human weapons. Had there been another way? Could they have found a path to peace that didn't involve so much bloodshed? These were questions that Keith had grappled with before, in the quiet moments between battles. But now, confronted with the grim reality of the occupation, they weighed on him more heavily than ever. He was jolted from his thoughts by the approach of Sergeant Akari, her armor still spattered with the blood of Nausicaan insurgents. She saluted crisply, her face a mask of stoic professionalism. "Sir, we've secured the Central District and set up checkpoints on all the major thoroughfares, but there's something you need to see." Keith frowned, gesturing for her to lead the way. They picked their way through the rubble-strewn streets, past groups of wary Nausicaan civilians and grim-faced Marines on patrol. Finally, they reached a makeshift hospital that had been set up in the shell of a bombed-out building. Inside, the stench of blood and decay was overpowering. Nausicaan medics moved among the rows of wounded, their scales spattered with gore as they fought to save the lives of their people. But it was the patients themselves that caught Keith's eye. They were not soldiers, but civilians. Women, children, the elderly. Their injuries were horrific, the kind inflicted by shrapnel and blast waves and collapsing buildings. Keith felt his gut clench as he took in the sheer scale of the suffering on display. "God damn it," he muttered, his voice tight with emotion. "This isn't right. These people aren't combatants. They didn't ask for any of this." Akari nodded grimly. "I know, sir, but this is the reality of occupation. We can't just pack up and leave now that the fighting's over. We have a responsibility to these people, to help them rebuild and find a way forward." Keith sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. He knew she was right, but that didn't make it any easier to stomach. He turned to leave, his mind already racing with the challenges that lay ahead. As they stepped back out into the ruined streets, Keith paused to survey the scene once more. The occupation was just beginning, and he knew that the road ahead would be long and fraught with peril. But he also knew that he couldn't turn his back on the Nausicaan people, not after everything they had endured. He straightened his shoulders, his expression resolute with willpower. "Come on," he said to Akari, "we've got work to do." You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.